The rain came down in a cold, merciless sheet, turning the forest floor into a treacherous mire of mud and slick leaves. It was a foolish time to be out, a time when sensible folk huddled by their hearths in the isolated village of Havenwood, praying the storm would pass. But Lena was not sensible, and her cabin had no hearth to speak of. She was a healer, and the fever break root waited for no woman's comfort. It grew only in the shadowed basin of the Black Creek ravine, and old Martha's boy was burning up, so she went, her oilskin cloak doing little to turn back the deluge, her basket clutched tight in one hand. She was gathering the last of the pale roots when a flicker of unnatural color caught her eye, a splash of buckskin and blood against the gray-brown gloom. It was a man, wedged between two moss-covered boulders at the bottom of the ravine, his body contorted at an angle that bespoke a violent end. Caution, a virtue drilled into every soul in Havenwood, screamed at her to turn back, to forget what she saw, but the healer in her, the stubborn legacy of the mother they had shunned, would not allow it. She slid down the muddy embankment, her boots finding little purchase, until she stood over him. He was a native warrior, his face a mask of sculpted plains and fierce pride, now slackened by pain. A brutal gash ran from his temple down his cheek, crudely stitched by his own hand, and the feathered shaft of an arrow protruded from the thick muscle of his shoulder. He was alive, barely. His breath was a shallow, rattling thing, a ghost in his chest. Lena knew the stories. The elders spoke of the native tribes as ghosts of the forest, savages to be feared and avoided. Contact was forbidden. To help one was to invite damnation upon them all. But looking at him, at the vulnerability in his unconscious form, she saw not a savage, but a man, broken and bleeding on the cold earth, just as any man from her own village would. The rain was washing the life from him. She made a choice. It was a choice that defied her village, her elders, and every rule of survival she had ever been taught. With a strength born of desperation, she looped her arms under his, ignoring the slick warmth of his blood, and began to drag him. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. Every step up the muddy ravine was a battle, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming. She slipped, fell, and rose again, fueled by a defiant compassion that was her only true inheritance. She could not leave him to die. It was not in her. By the time she reached the tree line near her cabin, twilight was bleeding into a starless, stormy night. She hauled him over the threshold of her small, isolated home on the very edge of the village, the door closing with a soft thud that felt as final as a prison gate shutting behind her. She had saved a man from the storm, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had just invited a far greater one into her life. The cabin was small, a single room filled with the scent of dried herbs and wood smoke. It was her sanctuary and her prison, the place the village tolerated her existence as long as she kept to its fringe. Now it was a secret hospital. She laid the warrior on her own cot, the only soft surface in the room, and lit every candle she owned, chasing the shadows into the corners. The work began. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but her hands were steady. This was her calling, the art for which she was both needed and scorned. She started with the arrow. The head was buried deep, a wicked barb of flint that would tear his flesh to ribbons if she pulled it straight out. She took a small, sharp knife from her leather pouch, its blade sterilized in the candle's flame until it glowed a dull orange. Whispering a half-remembered prayer to a god she wasn't sure listened to outcasts, she cut into his skin, her touch precise and practiced. The warrior groaned, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the floorboards. His eyes flickered open for a moment, dark pools of confusion and pain. Before rolling back into his head, Lena worked on, her focus absolute. She pushed the arrowhead through the other side of his shoulder, a brutal but necessary act, and snipped off the barb before drawing the smooth shaft back out. The wound bled freely, a cleansing river of red. She packed it with yarrow to stanch the flow and a poultice of comfrey root to begin the knitting of flesh and muscle. Next, she turned to the gash on his face. The stitches were crude, made of sinew, and the wound beneath was inflamed. She carefully snipped them away, cleaned the angry cut with willow bark tea, and applied a salve of calendula and goldenrod. His skin was hot to the touch. The fever was already setting in. For 3 days and 3 nights she did not sleep. She brewed feverfew and elderflower, forcing the bitter liquids between his cracked lips. She bathed his face and chest with cool water. She spoke to him in soft tones, not words of comfort, for he would not understand them, but the names of the herbs she was using, as if to introduce them as friends. In those long, silent hours, she studied him. His hair was long and black as a raven's wing. His body was a tapestry of scars, old and new, each one a story she could only guess at. He was younger than she first thought, perhaps her own age, but his face held the ancient gravity of a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. She was breaking every taboo, risking everything for a stranger the world had taught her to hate. But as she tended to his wounds, a strange sense of rightness settled over her. In healing him, she felt she was healing a part of her own lonely soul. The village of Havenwood, with its steepled church and its rigid piety, had never felt like home. They came to her for remedies in the dead of night, their faces cloaked in shame, but in the daylight they saw only the daughter of a witch. Her mother, a gifted healer like her, had been driven out years ago, her knowledge deemed unholy. Lena stayed, a ghost on the edge of town, because she had nowhere else to go. This warrior, this dangerous secret lying on her cot, was the first person to share her isolation in years, even if he was unconscious. On the fourth morning, the storm broke, and a weak, watery sunlight filtered through the cabin's single window. The warrior's fever had broken with it. His breathing was deep and even, his skin cool to the touch. Lena sat slumped in her chair, exhausted but relieved, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. His eyes opened. This time they stayed open. They were dark and intelligent, and they fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. There was no confusion in them now, only a sharp, wary assessment. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his movement surprisingly fluid for a man who had been at death's door. His gaze swept the small cabin, taking in the hanging bundles of herbs, the simmering pot on the cold hearth, and finally, Lena herself. He said nothing. The silence was thick with unspoken questions. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs. She was alone with a man the elders called a demon, a man who could likely kill her with one hand. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, and ladled some thin broth into a wooden bowl. She approached him not as a nursemaid approaches a patient, but as one might approach a wild, cornered animal. She held out the bowl, a simple offering. He stared at it, then back at her, his eyes narrowing. He did not trust her. He did not trust the offering. His world was likely one where kindness was a trick, a lure into a trap. Lena didn't retreat. She held her ground, meeting his gaze. She dipped her own finger into the broth and touched it to her lips, showing him it wasn't poisoned. It was a gesture her mother had taught her, a way to build trust with a frightened animal, or a frightened child. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. He reached out with his good hand and took the bowl. His fingers brushed hers, his skin warm and calloused. He drank the broth slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. When he was finished, he handed the bowl back. He pointed to himself. "Kalen," he said. The name was quiet, but it filled the small cabin with its strength. Lena's breath caught. He had given her his name. It was a gift, a first step across the chasm of fear and mistrust that separated their two worlds. She pointed to herself. "Lena," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, testing the name on his tongue without speaking it. He then pointed to the expertly dressed wound on his shoulder and then to her, a clear question in his eyes. "Who are you that you would do this for an enemy?" Lena had no answer he could understand. She could only hope that her actions had spoken for her. She had chosen compassion over fear, and now she could only pray that she hadn't made a fatal mistake. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope that her secret guest was a man of honor, not the monster of Havenwood's tales. But honor could not protect them from the judgment of her people, or from the men who had put the arrow in his shoulder in the first place. The days that followed fell into a quiet, watchful rhythm. Kalen healed with a speed that astonished Lena, a testament to a body honed by a life of hardship and discipline. He rarely spoke, but his silence was no longer hostile. It was observant. He watched her as she worked, grinding herbs, stitching new moccasins from a piece of scrap leather, tending to her small garden now that the storm had passed. Communication was a clumsy dance of gestures and single words. He taught her the name of his people for the sun, Nakai, and she taught him the word for water. He would point to a plant, and she would give him its name in her tongue, and he would give her its name in his. She learned that his people were the Stone Crows, a name that evoked images of resilient birds nesting in high, unreachable places. One afternoon, he took a piece of charcoal from the cold hearth and began to draw on the smooth, packed earth of the cabin floor. His hands, which she had only seen as weapons or the subject of her healing, moved with a surprising grace. He drew mountains, a river, and a settlement of hide lodges in his home. Then he drew men, stick figures, some carrying bows like his, others carrying the long, straight lines of rifles. He drew himself, fighting, and then he drew an X over the lodges of his people, a symbol of devastation that needed no translation. He drew a new figure, a man with a beard and a wide-brimmed hat, and pointed to the riflemen, their leader. He looked at Lena, his eyes dark with a grief so profound it made her own loneliness seem trivial. She understood. His people were gone or scattered. He was a survivor of a massacre. The men who had attacked him were not a rival tribe. They were men like those in her own world, men driven by greed and a hatred she could not comprehend. The knowledge settled in her stomach like a cold stone. The danger was not just that her village would find out about Kalen. The real danger was that the men who had hunted him were still out there. The secret she was keeping was no longer just about breaking a village taboo. It was about sheltering a fugitive from a war she hadn't known was raging just beyond the borders of their peaceful valley. Kalen's recovery progressed. He began to move around the cabin, testing his strength. He would watch the village from the edge of her window, his expression unreadable as he observed the settlers going about their daily chores, oblivious to the world of violence that lay just over the mountains. He saw the elder Matthias, a stern man with a face like a clenched fist, directing the men as they repaired the storm-damaged palisade wall. He saw the way the villagers gave Lena's cabin a wide berth, the way they would cross the path to avoid her if she stepped outside. He saw her isolation, and in his eyes, she saw a glimmer of understanding. He too was alone in the world. This shared desolation was the earth in which the fragile roots of their trust began to grow. He was no longer just her patient. He was her ally, her fellow exile. They were two solitary souls from warring worlds, huddled together in a tiny cabin with a much larger storm gathering on the horizon. The fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a rider. He came from the settlement of Crossroads, 2 days' ride to the east, his horse lathered and his face pale with terror. He brought news that sent a shockwave of fear through Havenwood. A militia, calling themselves the Iron Volunteers, was on the move. They were led by a ruthless man named Silas Richter, a former army captain who preached a doctrine of extermination against the native tribes. Richter's men were not soldiers. They were prospectors, failed farmers, and land grabbers, united by greed and a thirst for violence. They were sweeping through the territories, leaving a trail of burned villages and bodies in their wake. They claimed they were responding to native raids, but the rider from Crossroads spoke in a hushed, terrified whisper of massacres, of women and children cut down without mercy. They were not enforcing justice. They were clearing the land. When the rider described their leader, Silas Richter, a tall man with a dark beard and a cold, charismatic smile, Kalen, who had been listening from the shadows of Lena's cabin, went utterly still. He pressed his hand to the now faded scar on his face. It was him, the man from his drawings, the man who had destroyed his home and left him for dead. The Iron Volunteers were moving west, directly toward the isolated valley where Havenwood sat like a lamb tethered for slaughter. Panic gripped the village. The men gathered in the square, their faces grim, their voices a low murmur of fear. They were farmers and craftsmen, not soldiers. Their palisade wall was meant to deter wolves and bears, not a disciplined company of armed men. Matthias, the village elder, stood before them on the church steps, his voice ringing with a desperate piety. "We are a godly people," he thundered, his fist striking the air. "We have kept to ourselves. We have kept the holy laws. The Lord will not abandon us. He will be our shield and our fortress." He called for a day of fasting and prayer, convinced that their faith alone would prove to be an impenetrable defense. Lena watched from the edge of the square, her heart sinking. She knew, and Kalen knew, that faith would not stop the bullets of Silas Richter's rifles. She had to warn them. She had to make them understand the true nature of the threat. She pushed her way through the anxious crowd until she stood before the elder. "Matthias," she began, her voice shaking but clear. "Prayer is not enough. These are not men who will be turned aside by psalms. They are killers." Matthias turned his cold, furious gaze on her. "Silence, girl," he snarled, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and self-righteousness. "You, who walk the path of your heretic mother, dare to question the will of the Almighty? It is sin like yours that invites judgment upon us. Go back to your hovel and pray for your own wretched soul." The crowd recoiled from her, murmuring their agreement. They looked at her as if she were the source of the danger, a blight upon their purity. Defeated, she retreated, their scorn following her like stones thrown at her back. She returned to her cabin to find Kalen standing by the window, his body radiating a tense, coiled energy. He had heard. He had understood. He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a grim resolve. He owed her his life. He would not let her or the foolish people who scorned her fall to the man who had taken everything from him. The storm he had brought to her doorstep was about to break over them all. The days that followed were thick with a suffocating dread. The villagers of Havenwood prayed, they fasted, they patched the holes in their stockade and sharpened their farm implements into crude weapons, all while listening to Matthias's assurances that God would protect the righteous. They were children whistling in a graveyard, and the sound was unnerving. In Lena's cabin, the preparations were of a different nature. Kalen was a ghost of quiet, purposeful motion. He had regained much of his strength, and the warrior's discipline had taken over. He tested the balance of the wood axe, the weight of the splitting maul. He took the small knife Lena had used to cut the arrow from his shoulder and spent hours sharpening its edge on a whetstone until it could shave the hair from his arm. He was a man preparing for a war he knew was coming. Lena, in turn, prepared her own arsenal. She gathered the herbs that staunched bleeding, the roots that fought infection, the leaves that dulled pain. If prayer failed and fighting began, her skills would be needed. A new, unspoken partnership formed between them. While the village was united in fear, Lena and Kalen were united in purpose. They were the only two people in Havenwood who truly understood the nature of the wolf at their door. One evening, as Lena was grinding willow bark, Kalen stopped his restless pacing. He picked up a piece of charcoal again. On a clean patch of floor, he drew the layout of her cabin, the trees around it, the path to the village gate. Then he began to draw lines of attack, ambush points, fields of fire. He was showing her strategy, showing her how a warrior thinks. He pointed to the ravine where she had found him. Then he drew lines showing how a small, disciplined force could use the terrain, the woods, the creek beds, to harry a larger, less agile enemy. He was trying to teach her how to survive. The lesson was terrifying, but it was also empowering. It was a language of action, a counterpoint to the village's passive waiting. She was not just a healer. She was the guardian of a warrior, the keeper of a secret that might be their only hope. The fear she felt began to transform into a hard, cold resolve. She would not let these people, as foolish and cruel as they could be slaughtered because of their own willful ignorance. And she would not let Kalen die fighting for them. The sound of the lookout's horn cut through the morning mist 5 days after the rider's warning. It was a single panic blast followed by another and then another. They were here. Lena rushed to the window, Kalen at her side. On the ridge overlooking the valley, a long line of horsemen had appeared, their dark forms silhouetted against the gray sky. They were a serpent of steel and leather, coiling itself around the small, vulnerable village of Havenwood. They did not attack. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly professional. They fanned out, surrounding the entire stockade, cutting off all escape. They set up a camp just out of rifle range, the smoke from their cook fires rising like funeral pyres. The siege had begun. An hour later, a single rider detached from the main group and approached the village gate, a white flag of parley fluttering from a lance. It was Silas Richter. Silas Richter was a man who understood the theater of power. He sat tall on his magnificent black horse, dressed in a clean uniform that set him apart from his rough-looking men. He had a handsome, bearded face and a smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. He radiated a confidence that was more intimidating than any overt threat. Matthias and the other village elders met him at the gate, their faces pale and drawn. Lena and Kalen watched from the window of her cabin, which offered a clear, if distant view of the confrontation. "I am Silas Richter, commander of the Iron Volunteers," he announced, his voice carrying easily in the tense silence. "I am here under the authority of the territorial governor to put an end to the savage raids that have plagued this region. Matthias found his voice, puffing out his chest with a show of bravado that convinced no one. "There have been no raids in this valley, sir. We are a peaceful, God-fearing people." Richter's smile widened. "So you say. Yet my scouts report that the warrior responsible for the massacre at the Miller homestead fled in this direction. A man of the Stone Crow tribe, a murdering savage. We have reason to believe you are harboring this fugitive." A collective gasp went through the villagers gathered behind Matthias. The accusation was a lightning bolt, striking at the heart of their identity as a pure and separate community. "That is a lie," Matthias sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. We do not consort with heathens." "Wouldn't you?" Richter's gaze swept over the village, and then, with a chilling precision, it settled on Lena's cabin at the edge of the woods. "My scout tracked the warrior to the Black Creek ravine. He also saw a woman from this village, a healer, tending to her garden near that very spot. Tell me, Elder, do you have a healer who lives apart from the rest of you? A woman who might have sympathies for the forest folk?" The trap had been sprung, every head turned, every eye fixed on Lena's small home. The murmurs started, a low, ugly sound of suspicion turning to certainty. The outcast, the witch's daughter. She was the only one who would dare. She was the source of their troubles. Lena felt the blood drain from her face. Kalen beside her went rigid, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the knife tucked into his waistband. Richter's voice cut through the murmurs again, smooth and reasonable. "I'm a reasonable man. I do not wish to bring harm to a community of good Christians. Surrender the fugitive and the woman who aided him. In return, I will spare your village and see you are commended for your cooperation. You have 1 hour to comply." He turned his horse with a leisurely grace and rode back to his men, leaving chaos and accusation in his wake. The villagers of Havenwood, who had been united in their fear of the outside world, now turned that fear inward, and it was aimed like a loaded gun directly at Lena. The hour Richter had given them was an eternity of rising hysteria. The villagers, their faith shattered by a direct accusation, needed a sacrifice. They found one in Lena. The fear and suspicion that had simmered beneath the surface for years now boiled over into open hatred. They saw her not as a healer, but as a traitor, the serpent they had allowed to live in their garden. Matthias, his authority crumbling, seized on the opportunity to redirect the blame and reassert his power. He stood on the church steps, his face a mask of righteous fury, and pointed a trembling finger toward Lena's cabin. "She has done this! The heretic's child has brought God's wrath upon us," he shrieked. "She has consorted with demons and brought a devil into our midst. We must cast her out. We must give the beast what it wants to save ourselves." His words were the spark that lit the fuse. The crowd became a mob. They surged forward, their faces twisted with fear and rage, brandishing hoes and axes and pitchforks. They were no longer God-fearing farmers, they were a lynch mob, and they were coming for her. Inside the cabin, Lena's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at Kalen. His face was a stone mask, his eyes burning with a cold, protective fury. He understood what was happening. He knew they were coming to drag her out and hand her over to the man who had murdered his family. He was faced with an impossible choice. He could stay hidden and watch the woman who saved his life be sacrificed, or he could reveal himself, confirming their accusations and likely starting a battle that would end with his death and the destruction of the village. "Go," Lena whispered, her voice trembling. "Out the back. Run to the mountains. You can make it." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of disbelief. Did she truly think he would abandon her? He shook his head, a single sharp gesture. He owed her a life debt. He would pay it. The cabin door splintered under the impact of a heavy log. The mob was there. Rough hands grabbed Lena, pulling her from the relative safety of her home and into the harsh daylight. They dragged her toward the village square, their insults and accusations raining down on her. "Witch! Traitor! Savage lover!" She stumbled, her knees hitting the muddy ground. Matthias stood over her, his face triumphant. "Confess that you have brought this curse upon us." He raised his hand to strike her. Suddenly a figure emerged from the doorway of her cabin, as silent and formidable as a spirit of vengeance. It was Kalen. He was not the broken man she had found in the ravine. He stood tall and straight, his bare chest a roadmap of scars, his black hair stirring in the breeze. He held only the small knife she had given him, but in his hand it looked as deadly as any sword. A collective gasp rippled through the mob. They fell back, their rage momentarily replaced by a primal fear. The demon of their stories was real, and he was standing before them. Silas Rector, watching from his camp, raised a spyglass to his eye, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. The fugitive had revealed himself. The hunt was almost over. Kalen took a slow step forward, placing himself between Lena and the mob. He ignored the villagers, his burning gaze fixed on the man who had brought this ruin upon them all, Matthias. He raised the knife not as a threat, but as a pointer, aiming it directly at the elder's chest. Then he spoke, and the sound of his voice, calm and clear, shocked the villagers into silence. He did not speak in his native tongue. He spoke in theirs, the words still accented but undeniably clear. "You speak of demons," Kalen said, his voice resonating with a power that belied his simple weapon. "But the only demon here is the one you see in your own fearful heart." He turned his attention from Matthias to the stunned crowd. "This woman," he said, gesturing to Lena with his chin, "is not a witch. She is a healer. She saved my life when your God and your prayers would have left me to die in a ditch. Her compassion is a thing of greater strength than all the stone in your church." He took another step forward, his eyes sweeping over their fearful faces. "You hide behind your walls and your faith, but you are blind. The man who surrounds your village, Silas Richter, he is the savage. He and his men attacked my people without provocation. They burned our homes, they murdered our children. I am not a fugitive from justice. I am a survivor of a massacre." The villagers stared, their certainty beginning to waver. The warrior's words held the clear, cold ring of truth. The story he told was far more terrifying than the fables spun by their elder. Richter and his militia were not protectors. They were predators. Kalen then turned his gaze toward the militia camp, raising his voice so it would carry across the field. "Silas Richter," he called out, "you hunt me in the name of your law, but you are a coward who attacks the sleeping and the helpless. I am Kalen of the Stone Crows. I challenge you. Face me, one warrior to another, your life against mine. The victor will decide the fate of this village and the life of this woman. If you are a commander and not a butcher, you will accept." A murmur went through the militia camp, a formal challenge. It was an ancient code, one that even hardened men like them understood. It was a test of their leader's courage. Richter lowered his spyglass. Kalen had played his hand brilliantly. He had turned the situation from a simple siege into a personal duel. To refuse would be to show cowardice in front of his men, to shatter the myth of his own martial prowess. Arrogance and pride were Richter's greatest weaknesses. He spurred his horse forward, a cruel smirk on his face. "A brave speech for a dead man," Richter called back, drawing a heavy, shining cavalry saber from its scabbard. "I accept your challenge. I will enjoy cutting you down before these people and claiming my prize." The final confrontation was set. Not a battle of armies, but a duel of two men, representing two worlds, with the soul of Havenwood hanging in the balance. The village square became a makeshift arena. The villagers formed a wide, silent circle, their faces a mixture of terror and a new, grudging respect for the warrior they had just condemned. Richter's men lined the far side, their rifles held loosely, their expressions eager for the blood sport. Lena watched, her heart a cold, tight knot in her chest. She had been saved, but the price might be Kalen's life. Richter dismounted, handing the reins of his horse to a subordinate. He was a large man, powerfully built, and his polished saber seemed to hum with menace in the pale light. He flexed his shoulders, confident and contemptuous. Kalen stood opposite him, a stark contrast. He was leaner, more sinewy, armed with nothing but his small knife and an intimate knowledge of violence. He moved with the fluid grace of a panther, his bare feet planted firmly on the earth, as if drawing strength from it. "No tricks, savage," Richter sneered, circling him. "Just you and me." Kalen didn't reply. He saved his breath, his eyes never leaving Richter's, watching his shoulders, his feet, the way he held the heavy blade. The fight began with a sudden, explosive rush from Richter. He swung the saber in a great, cleaving arc meant to end the duel in a single blow. Kalen was not there. He moved like smoke, flowing under the whistling blade and darting away, forcing Richter to reset. It was a dance of brute force against fluid grace, a hammer against water. Richter was stronger, his reach longer. He pressed his attack, his saber crashing down again and again, churning the earth where Kalen had been moments before. He was fighting with rage, trying to overwhelm his opponent. Kalen fought with his mind. He was patient, economical in his movements, letting Richter exhaust himself. He used the terrain, drawing Richter over the uneven ground of the square, forcing him to watch his footing. He made a few quick, testing lunges with his knife, forcing Richter to parry with the heavy saber, frustrating him, making him angrier. The frustration made Richter careless. He lunged forward, overextending himself, and Kalen saw his opening. He didn't attack. Instead, he dropped low and swept his leg out, catching Richter's ankle. The big man, caught off balance, stumbled and fell heavily to one knee. Before Richter could recover, Kalen was on him. He didn't go for the kill. He brought the hilt of his knife down hard on Richter's sword hand. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the saber clattered to the ground. Richter roared in pain and surprise. In the next instant, Kalen had pressed the razor-sharp edge of his knife against Richter's throat. The entire square held its breath. The duel was over. Kalen leaned in close, his voice a low, dangerous whisper for Richter's ears only. "This is the mercy you did not show to my people." Then he stood up, removing the blade. He had won. He had proven his point not just by defeating his enemy, but by showing a moral strength Richter could never comprehend. The militia stared in stunned silence. Their invincible leader was kneeling in the dirt, disarmed and humiliated by a lone warrior with a knife. The spell of his authority was broken. Kalen stood, breathing heavily, a new cut bleeding on his arm from a glancing blow he'd taken. He looked at Lena, and in his eyes she saw the relief, the pain, and the confirmation of the vow he had made to her in the silence of her cabin. He had paid his debt. The defeat of their leader shattered the will of the Iron Volunteers. They were mercenaries and bullies, not fanatics. Without Richter's charismatic cruelty to bind them, their cohesion dissolved. A few of the more loyal men helped their disgraced commander onto his horse, and the entire militia, which had looked so formidable just an hour before, began a quiet, shameful retreat, melting back into the wilderness from which they came. The siege was broken. As the last of the riders disappeared over the ridge, a profound silence fell over Havenwood. The villagers stood frozen, looking from the retreating militia to the lone, wounded warrior in their square. They looked at Lena, who was now rushing to Kalen's side, tearing a strip from her dress to bind his arm. They saw not a heretic and a demon, but their saviors. The weight of their foolishness, their fear, and their cruelty descended upon them. Shame was a far heavier burden than fear had ever been. Matthias, his face pale and shrunken, approached them. He looked old and broken, his righteous certainty stripped away to reveal the terrified man beneath. He stopped before Lena and Kalen, unable to meet their eyes. "We were wrong," he stammered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "We were blind. Can you forgive us?" Lena looked at the faces in the crowd, at the downcast eyes and humbled shoulders. There was no triumph in her heart, only a deep, weary sadness for their wasted fear. "There is nothing to forgive," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Fear makes people blind. It is time for all of us to learn to see again." A few days later, a patrol of territorial marshals, alerted by a farmer from an outlying homestead who had seen the militia and ridden for help, arrived in the valley. They took sworn statements from Lena, Kalen, and the village elders. Kalen's testimony, combined with the evidence of Richter's brutality from other settlements, was enough to see the man hunted down and brought to justice. The threat was truly over. The healing of Havenwood had begun. Kalen stayed. His own people were scattered to the winds, and he felt a strange sense of belonging in this village that had first condemned him and then been saved by him. He helped the men rebuild the sections of the palisade his own strategic mind had identified as weak. He taught them how to track, how to read the land, how to truly see the forest they had lived beside but never understood. Lena was no longer an outcast, she was revered. Her cabin became a place of respect, not fear. Villagers came to her openly, not just for remedies for the body, but for the wisdom of a woman who had chosen compassion in the face of hatred. The chasm between their two worlds began to close, bridged by the courage of a warrior and the compassion of a healer. One evening, as the sun set over the now peaceful valley, Lena and Kalen stood on the hill overlooking the village. A new house was being built for them, near the center of town, a joint effort by all the villagers. "You saved them," Lena said softly, looking at the twinkling lights of the homes below. Kalen shook his head, his gaze fixed on her. "You saved me first," he said. "And in saving me, you saved them from themselves." He took her hand, his scarred fingers lacing with hers. Their bond, forged in the crucible of a storm and tested in the fire of battle, was now the foundation of a new era for Havenwood. A girl had saved a wounded warrior, and in that single act of grace, she had saved them all, creating a future brighter than anyone had dared to imagine.